Good evening, viewers. Welcome back to my channel Literary. I'm Dr. Seema Sinha. Please like and subscribe to my channel and post your comments in the comment section. Today I will upload a lecture on Ted Hughes and his poem Pike. I've already discussed Ted Hughes's poem Chaucer in my previous lecture, and today I will discuss his poem Pike in detail with original insights. Ted Hughes, as we all know, is one of the major names, or he is one of the greatest poets of the 20th century who belong to the postmodern era. He and his wife, Sylvia Plath, they are the names to be reckoned with, and they have established the genre of postmodern poetry firmly on its feet. Ted Hughes, Philip Larkin, Sylvia Plath. These names automatically have come to represent what postmodern poetry exactly means, what its characteristics are. Postmodern, as the name suggests, or as it tells you, it is obviously a development of modern poetry. Modern poetry, the era which began in the early 20th century and which marked a revolutionary change, a complete break from the poetry or literature as it was expressed before in the 19th century and the traditional forms of expression. Postmodernism came into trend or existence, or its marked its growth or its characteristics, exhibiting its difference from modern literature in the post-war years. Modern poetry or modern literature can be said to be the period between the early 20th century and the aftermath of both the wars. Postmodern poetry, we can pinpoint or we can emphasize it to be the period from the 1960s onwards. Modern poetry had established its revolutionary changes, and postmodernism exhibits its growth in different directions or different forms of expression. And there are certain things or certain characteristics which mark it as different from modern poetry. What are the trends in postmodern poetry? They are intertextuality, mingling of ancient and futuristic, fluidity of meanings. These characteristics are obviously common to modern poetry as well. What makes postmodern literature different in a striking way from modern poetry is that postmodern poetry is not fragmented and disjointed in expression. Rather, as we will see in this poem Pike, we have already seen in Chaucer by Ted Hughes and Sylvia Plath's poems The Beekeeper's Daughter and Daddy, is composed in a more formal way. It has a more conventional pattern. It is not fragmented, disjointed, and completely experimental as modern literature was, as we can take the example of the greatest epic of the 20th century, The Wasteland. Now, intense subjectivity or a personal truth is common to both modern and postmodern poetry. But then, in modern poetry, the movement is towards finding an universal truth, as is the quest in almost all great literature, in the poetry of the Romantics, in the poetry of the Victorians, in great literature in any form, in any expression, in any language. But the postmodern poets, they try to grapple with their own personal truth. They do not try to formulate a truth for the entire mankind. They do not want, or they do not have, or the inclination to present an universal philosophy of life. They are not on a quest. They are just trying to find some kind of meaning, some kind of stability, some kind of relevance which is personal to them. It might not be perfect. It might not be the truth for everyone. But then they are not trying to offer a solution to the world. The most obvious trends in modern literature, modern poetry, that is of absurdism, non-linear narrative, break with traditional form of writing, is not present in postmodern poetry. Blended images, which was the influence of the early images and which is very pronounced in T.S. Eliot, particularly The Wasteland, is not the style of the postmodern poets. The stream of consciousness technique, because it is inevitable when the expression is of a very personal and subjective experience, is common to both postmodern and modern poetry. Multiplicity of themes, blending of images, a kind of non-linear narrative. These were the characteristics of modern poetry. The postmodern poets, when they have a multiplicity of themes, they usually look at it with a kind of ironical playfulness, as we have seen in Chaucer, with a dark humor and almost a sardonic viewpoint. That very seriousness of a very profound quest for meaning is not present in the postmodern poets, because they are looking for, or they are presenting their own truth, and it need not be the truth for everyone. Moreover, it may not be a perfect truth. They are not trying to offer a solution to the world like T.S. Eliot has done in The Wasteland. One of the very famous quotations about postmodern literature, which shows its difference from modern literature, and which has expressed the difference very clearly, is quotation: "Postmodern literature celebrated the meaninglessness of the world and embraced the obscure and the nonsensical. Full stop. It blurred the line between reality and fiction and had fun doing it." Quotation closed. So the byword here is fun. There is a sense of playfulness, as we have seen in Chaucer, where Ted Hughes expresses his admiration for Chaucer and also his dissatisfaction with the way the beauty of Chaucer leaves people cold and it is unperceived, by comparing the audience to cows. So there is an element of this playfulness. So maybe that makes postmodern poetry less heavy than modern poetry, and it has that element of almost a playful quality, which is very visible in poets like Philip Larkin and Ogden Nash. Now, let us just consider the prime example of postmodern poetry to be The Wasteland, and see how all the characteristics of the modern poetry are visible there, and compare, or if we want to underline the differences by taking the elements of disjointed, fragmentary expression, lines, non-linear narrative, moving back and forth, multiple perspectives, multiple points of view, and finding that they are not the case in postmodern poetry like Ted Hughes's Chaucer or his Pike or Sylvia Plath's The Beekeeper's Daughter, and her very famous poem, Daddy. They do not have a non-linear narrative. They move in a very straightforward manner. Neither do they have different perspectives. All these poems are expressed from a single perspective, that of the poet herself or himself. Now, let us look at Ted Hughes, Edward James Hughes, 17 October 1930 to 28 October 1998, poet laureate from 1984 to 1998. His major works were done between 1957 and 1970, and his first work was The Hawk in the Rain. His other poem, Chaucer, has already been analyzed. So let us take a look at the poem Pike. Another thing which I mentioned was that the postmodern poets, they have a very conventional pattern of writing their poems. The composition is formal, as we have seen in Daddy, we have seen in Chaucer, we have seen in The Beekeeper's Daughter, and it is again a very striking feature of the poem Pike, which is in 11 stanzas with a formal composition expressing what the poet wishes to say and expressing it in lines which have almost meticulous and a very formal and a very conventional pattern or composition. This poem Pike, it springs from his own his own personal experience. Like we all know that modern literature is intensely subjective, and postmodern literature is also continues with that same subjectivity, only that truth or that experience is even more personal. It is personal to the poet or the poetess who is writing. Ted Hughes, this poem Pike is about pike, which is a species of fish. It is a fish which has fascinated Ted Hughes because Ted Hughes was an avid outdoors man. He was a hunter, he was a fisher, he had worked in the zoo, he was very interested in the animal world. He seemed to have a close association with the animals which he had watched intensely. His communication or his fascination or with his feeling of interest or his observation of this particular fish dated back from his childhood. This poem was published in 1960 in his collection Lupercal, and it was it has remained a very famous poem. Quotation, which in Ted Hughes's words: fishing provides that connection with the whole living world. It gives you the opportunity of being totally immersed, turning back into yourself in a good way, a form of meditation, form of communion with levels of yourself that are deeper than the ordinary self. So this fishing is, or this experience of his angling with the fish pike is a kind of a otherworldly experience. It is not only a physical thrill, but it sort of gives him a sense of communicating with those primitive animal forces which seem to lie dormant in all of us. So let us see what the poem says. He describes the fish pike in very vivid terms. The entire poem talks about the movement of the pike, the impression which the pike creates on the poet's mind as it moves through the water, as it surfaces, as it seems to show its shadowy form, as on those days when the water is still and the depths are almost visible, the poet can see its outline in among the reeds and the rushes in the water. Ted Hughes here talks about a pond which he says is almost like a lake. It's a pond which is quite huge. It has great depths. It has been his haunt from his childhood days. And there he has often, as a child, as an adult, as a grown-up man, gone there, watched the fish, seen it, been fascinated by it, watched it, and is almost frightened by it, because the pike is a monster fish. It can grow to huge lengths. It is carnivorous. It has that almost malevolent appearance with huge jaws. It moves silently through the waters. Without warning, it appears. It does not give any warning of its approach. It is, on the whole, almost a sinister figure. So the poet says that the pike is perfect. It can be 3 inches long. It can grow up to huge lengths. It seems impossible that it has originated from a tiny egg. One can see that it is just beneath the surface of the water because of the dancing flies which are attracted to it, or which attract the pike to come to the surface, rise to it to eat the flies. The second stanza, he says, or move, stand by their own grandeur, over a bed of emerald, silhouette of submarine delicacy and horror, 100 feet long in the world. And in the second stanza, that beauty of the pike, it transitions into something sinister almost, because it seems like some primitive monster. Only the silhouette was visible in the deep emerald green blue of the depths of the pond, and its silent movement, its delicate maneuvers, almost reminds the poet of a submarine. And in the world, they are the emperors of the world, of the silent, cold, deep world. Just like the submarines, they glide softly through the depths. In ponds, under the heat-struck lily pads, gloom of the stillness, logged on last year's black leaves, watching upwards, or hung in an amber cavern of weeds. And the description is very poetic, as visual, creating that subterranean world of depths, of water rushes, of underwater weeds, of the lily leaves which have withered, the last year leaves which are now withered and black, and underneath those leaves the silent form, still waiting and watching, hidden, almost hidden in the thickness of the weeds. The jaws, hooked, clamp and fangs, not to be changed at this date, a life subdued to its instrument, the gills kneading quietly, and the pectorals, 3 we kept behind glass, jungled in weed, 3 inches, 4 and 4.5, fed fry to them. Suddenly they were 2, finally 1. And in these next 2 stanzas, he describes the predatory quality of these fish, because they are carnivores. They are almost cannibalistic, because sometimes they feed on themselves and when they don't get prey. And this quality about them, it's an antithesis to their physical beauty, which is mesmerizing, which is fascinating. And their jaws, the gills, the hooked fangs, they all point out to the primitive ancestors, to the prehistoric animals which this fish were, and which has not changed much. And the poet says that we kept In the fifth stanza, he says how they fed on each other, 3 and 4, and finally they were 2, and then only 1. That means they were eating each other. They were hunting on each other. With a sag belly and grin it was born with. And indeed they spared nobody. 2 6 pounds each, over 2 foot long, high and dry in the willow's herb. And then the remaining, the victor of this battle for survival, of battle which ends in death, the one which remains with sagged belly, that means the belly which is full, the open mouth, which seems to be in a malevolent grin, and which shows that for them, they still live in that ancient primitive world governed by their own rules. One jammed past its gill, down the other's gullet. The outside eyes shed as the vice locks, that some iron in his eye, though the film shrank in death. And sometimes they try to eat each other, and it ends in a death, an embrace of death. It ends in a combat which means death for both. They are locked in that mortal and that final struggle or that conflict with each other. Both of them locked with their faces, their eyes glassy in death, prepared to devour each other, but both of them killing each other. One jumped past its gill down to the other's gullet, and outside eyes stared as a vice locks, that same iron in his eye, through the film shrank in death. And both of them still dead, eyes filmed, still glassy, stare, and their jaws clamped against each other, killing each other. A pond I fished 50 yards across, whose lilies and muscular stench had outlasted every visible stone of the monastery that planted them. Still legendary depth, it was as deep as England it held. Pike too immersed to stir, so immense and old, that past nightfall I dared not cast. And the poet remembers his childhood experience fishing in a pond, which was old, which was older than the monastery, that medieval monastery beside which it stood, and which when it had been dug and made with great depths, and where the poet knew there was home to ancient monster fish, the pike. It was mysterious. It hid itself in the depths of the dark water, in the deep stillness of the pond. No one knew how deep. It was there. The poet was aware of its presence. The poet was scared to go there. It seemed to hold his mind in fear. It captivated his imagination. It entranced him. But at the same time, it created a model fear in him. That past nightfall I dare not cast. And he said that I dare not challenge that pike by trying to cast my line. I was afraid that it would bite it, and then I would be locked in a combat with it. And I did not have the courage to challenge that ancient monster fish, but silently cast and fished with the air frozen on my head, for what might move, for what might have the still splashes on the dark pond. And the poet says that I fished with a feeling of dread, with a feeling of fright, with a feeling of terror, with a sense of unease, with consciousness that I might be faced with this monster fish. My hair froze. All my hackles were raised. All my senses were on alert. I was filled with this fear. Owls hushing the floating woods, frail on my ear against the dream. Darkness beneath night's darkness had freed, that rose slowly towards me, watching. And that ancient fear, that fear of the unknown, that fear of, that sense of dread, that awareness of danger, that dream, that nightmare, that I might be faced with my greatest fear. And my greatest fear, I felt, was slowly rising from the depths, watching me, silently coming up towards me. And that seemed, in that moment, I seemed that I was facing the most and the deepest and the greatest fear of my young life. So this poem, Pike, in these perfectly composed lines, in the conventional pattern, describing the fish as 3 inches long, the tiny fish, and as the lines move, slowly building up that atmosphere of describing of its awe, its majesty, its power, its ability to vanquish, its primitive hunting skills, its cannibalistic instincts, its ruthless, the ruthless hunter it was, the fact that it was a carnivore, its beauty, its variance with its gills, its fangs, its open mouth, which reminded that it had descended, or it was a part of that ancient primitive world. So, and then Ted Hughes, or Edward James Hughes, as his formal name was, being an avid hunter, a great fisherman, someone who was in close contact with the animals, feels that this communion with the pike is like he is challenging himself, as the last stanza says, forcing himself to face his greatest fear and to test his courage or his endurance. In Ted Hughes's words again, quotation, these are, he talks about Pike, these are remains of what the world was once like all over. They carry us back to the surroundings our ancestors lived in 150 million years. Those prehistoric feelings, satisfactions we are so hardly aware of, except as a sensation of pleasure, these are like a blood transfusion to us. And in wild surroundings, they rise to the surface and refresh us, renew us. This can be read in context with the last lines, where he says that when he faces his greatest fear, and when he casts and he is conscious of the presence of the monster fish in the depths, afraid that it will rise and he will have to confront it, it gives him that savage thrill, which he says is like a transfusion of blood, which fills him with new energy. And then he says again, when I was feeling good, I'd have dreams of giant pike that were perhaps also leopards. They'd become symbols of really deep, vital life. My obsession with pike maybe was my obsession with those energies. So he says, this obsession, this fascination, this intense and disturbing desire to confront the pike, and also his fear at the thought, was like something which satisfied a deep instinct in him, and these primitive energies which he was conscious of. And he says again, and if I were deprived of that kind of intimate, interactive existence, allowing myself to be possessed by and possessing the sort of world through fishing, it would be as though I had some great vital part of me amputated. So it is like lifeblood to him, this fishing and this facing the challenge, this facing his dread, this terror, this thrill, and this experience of the rawness of the primitive world. And this has stayed with him all his life, from his boyhood fishing in the Lawton Pond of Yorkshire, where he grew up. And it has sort of created a very poetic feeling in him towards the predatory animals, which he expresses so beautifully in Pike, which is visually captivating, which builds up or which shows the pike not only as a beautiful fish, but also as a primitive, bloodthirsty, carnivorous, cannibalistic, ruthless, prehistoric animal belonging to a world which was savage. And Ted Hughes feels in communion with this world, which gives him a deep satisfaction and a sense of being alive when he fishes for the pike. Now, this theme of the desire or the search for one's own identity, an effort to understand one's own responses or reactions, a kind of experience which goes beyond the physical, almost to an emotional and a spiritual level, because as Ted Hughes had said that fishing for the pike is not merely a sport for him, but it also gives him a deeper understanding of life and of himself as well. In passing, or because literature always gives or it presents us an opportunity to find this extra dimension and also to discover similarities in the same kind of expression with the quest or the trying to find the same kind of meaning of life. The struggle between man and animal is very powerfully expressed in other great pieces of literature. Of these, two come to my mind, and of course they are classics, just like this poem is a classic, but in a different form of literary expression. These two are the novella The Old Man and the Sea and the great novel Moby Dick. In both these great works, we have the struggle between man and animal. And both of them transition from the physical to the spiritual and to the emotional. It is not only, it is a physical struggle, but at the same time, it has that added dimension. It gives us something more than just the physical description of the struggle. The Old Man and the Sea, the great novella by Ernest Hemingway, which was published in 1951 and which was written in 1951 and then published in 1952. The last work published by Hemingway in his lifetime talks about the struggle between the fisherman Santiago and the giant Merlin fish and the sharks, which is the theme of this novel. And it portrays the struggle between the undying spirit, the essential nobility of man's soul, and the primitive animal forces of nature, where one tries to defeat the other. And Santiago was the Cuban fisherman fishing in the Gulf Stream. This novella won the Pulitzer Prize in 1953, and then it was cited as one of the major works which contributed to Ernest Hemingway getting the Nobel Prize in 1954. Santiago was a Cuban fisherman. He was facing a bad run of luck. For 84 days, he was unable to catch any fish. That meant no income for him. Finally, he decides to go on the 85th day. He went far out on the sea. He decided that this was the day his luck was going to change. Finally, he did hook a giant marlin, a huge fish, which was like a dream catch. But the marlin was a mighty fish, was not ready to give in so easily. And the struggle between the fisherman, Santiago, and this marlin went on for 2 days and 2 nights. Santiago did not give away. With an almost superhuman strength, with all the strength of his mind and his body and his soul, he did not let the marlin go or get away. He let the marlin take his boat far out in the sea, fighting with it for 2 days and 2 nights, going without sleep, somehow surviving, till marlin was tired and he killed it. But the thoughts which go on in Santiago's mind, it seems that he develops an affinity with the marlin he has hooked. Just like Ted Hughes feels a sense of communication with the pike, with the huge monster fish. For him, they are not just a fish, they are a symbol of something more. Similarly, the struggle between Santiago and the huge marlin is a struggle between man's essential strength, nobility, and the primitive forces of nature. In the end, he does kill the marlin, but while in return, he was far out in the sea. Before coming to the shore, the sharks attack and kill eat the entire marlin. And when he returns back to the port, only the head of the fish remains. But essentially, the theme is about the struggle between man and nature. Now, in Moby Dick also, the novel 1851, written by Herman Melville, Herman Melville was a sailor, so just like Ernest Hemingway, who was also a great wild game hunter, big game hunter, as well as a fisherman and a great sportsman. And as we know that Ted Hughes also was a hunter and a fisher, and as well as someone who had observed animals very closely. Herman Melville had been a sailor on huge whalers, which were ships which hunted whales. Moby Dick is about a man's revenge against a white whale, an albino whale, and it is narrated through the eyes or the words of a man or a sailor called Ishmael, who talks about Ahab, who was a captain on one of these whalers. This great albino whale had crippled Ahab on one of the attacks, because whaling is also very brutal. And since then, Ahab had been possessed with a maniacal desire for revenge against this albino whale who is called Moby Dick. And he spends his life in pursuit of this giant whale, chasing him across the world. And again, this struggle becomes symbolic of something more than a struggle between a man and beast. It becomes a spiritual quest. It becomes a spiritual struggle. It becomes an emotional struggle. So I've just given the examples of these two great works, The Old Man and the Sea and Moby Dick, because they also present these animals as Incidentally, fish in all these three great works of literature, Pike and The Old Man and the Sea and Moby Dick, a whale, a marlin, and of course the fish, pike, as symbolic of something far greater, deeper, meaningful, as complex, as something which has a very deep significance. As Ted Hughes has said, that this is, if he did not experience this thrill, it would be like a sense of feeling of incompleteness. It is what makes him complete. And it seems to answer a need in it, because these primitive instincts are present in all of us. Again, I will take the example of another great piece of literature that is also a symbolic narration of these primitive instincts and how they seem to correspond, or they seem to exist in all of us. And this novel is Lord of the Flies, where we see that the school, even the small children, give in, or they surrender to these animal instincts which prove to be more powerful than them. And we know how they descend into some kind of a stage of existence which takes them back to that primitive, prehistoric world, or that sense of reality or consciousness. And in Pike, it is very clear that what the poet means to express is, or that sense of amenity, or the deep sense of communication which he feels, or that sense of meaningfulness, of satisfying a deep desire in him, as communicating with something which is not alien, but which seems to draw him with a deep sense of fascination, is something which is a part of his deepest self. So this idea expressed this deep, this very profound thought, this very complex feeling which exists in perhaps all of us, is expressed beautifully in a very beautiful poetic language, in a poem which has a perfect formal composition, very rhythmic, with no sense of brokenness, no disjointed expression, but a poem which is complete in itself, technically perfect, with a great depth of meaning, intensely subjective, and expressing the poet's own deep emotions, needs, desires, and feelings. Thank you.